Dungeons. Dungeons are very important. I almost tipped over my microphone, but I digress. Welcome back to another video. If you haven't seen by the title already, we are talking about dungeons in Dungeons & Dragons. With dungeons being quite literally half of the game and half of the name, they're decently important, and making sure that they're high quality and that your players remember them throughout their whole experience and adventure is quite important. So today, that's what I'm talking about, dungeons, and how you can be the master of your own dungeons. I'm great with these jokes, aren't I? I'm fantastic, I love jokes! So without further ado, here are 5 things you can do to make your dungeons a masterclass. And no, I am not going to stop with the dungeon and master puns throughout this entire video, so I hope you're ready. Number 1. The environment of your dungeon is a very important thing to consider. Think about who is inside of your cave, right? If you have a bunch of bandits, they're going to shape the environment of this cave quite a bit. They're probably going to make some fortifications out of wood, stone, maybe add some traps, and they're going to light most of it with torches, especially if they are a race without dark vision. Or perhaps if you have a cave filled with kobolds, they won't have any torches since they all have dark vision, and they'll probably lay more traps and their fortifications may be lesser. And also, when speaking about environment, the other obvious idea that comes to mind is the geography of the area. Is your dungeon a sinking castle in a bog? In that case, it might be, well, hard to navigate, and lots of it is probably covered in water, mud, and other icky, gooey, sticky things. Or perhaps it's a tomb upon a icy mountain peak, and inside's all icy and cold and dark, and maybe it even has like undead inside of it. Number 2, traps. Everyone loves them, everyone has seen them, everyone's heard of them. And that's sort of a problem. If your players are new to the whole RPG dungeon thing, then perhaps a simple tripwire trap will, be enough to trap them. Although, if your players are familiar with RPGs and dungeons and how traps work, they've played Skyrim before, they've played Elden Ring, they know how this works. Try to get more creative with your traps. Perhaps the puzzles and the traps are intertwined with each other, so in order to essentially get the players trapped, they have to solve a puzzle, or rather, fail to solve a puzzle. Picture this. The party enters a room. It's completely empty. It's a relatively square room. And in the middle, an hourglass. And the second they walk in, the iron door closes behind them. And the hourglass begins to drain. And they only have maybe about 60 seconds to figure out how to escape the room with different clues that are just kind of scattered around the floor and maybe on parts of the pillar. This makes the trap way more interactive than just make a dexterity saving throw. Oops, you're in the spike pit. You take 1 trillion damage and bleed to death. Making your traps a more interactive and almost puzzle-like experience will make the dungeon a lot more interesting. My favorite one to do on my players is to give them riddles, and if they answer it wrong, kill them. Trap rooms are a very good way of making a interesting sort of puzzle experience, but there are many other things you can do. Just get creative with it. I'm sure there's many other things I haven't even thought of that you can do that are very cool. Number 3, when introducing monsters to your dungeon, or creatures, or whatever they are, what are they doing there? What is their purpose for being there? Knowing why your creatures exist within the dungeon is very important, because if you don't really know why they're there, there's really no importance to the dungeon. A good example of knowing why your creatures exist within this dungeon is a goblin cave. Because the goblins just know the cave far better than your players do, probably, it is important that your goblins know how to ambush the party through dark corners or tunnels that the party has no idea are even there. This gives a really good immersive feeling that these goblins, this is their home and you are the intruder. So when designing any dungeon, the things that live inside are there for a reason. Perhaps, if you played Skyrim, you remember the Draugr, the undead that guard the ancient Nordic tombs, and they burst out of their tombs and ambush the player. This can also just be applied to Dungeons and Dragons. If you have a tomb, have undead jump out of tombs and corners and different strange places, because it is their burial site, who's to say where they got buried? Just really consider how your enemies, your creatures inside your dungeon, can be as creative as your players. Number 4. No dungeon is complete without a story. When designing your dungeon, who built it? Think about that. Why was it built? For what purpose was it created? Perhaps the dungeon belonged to a king long ago, or perhaps it is a tomb to bury the dead of a long-lost kingdom. Or if your dungeon is just a cave, perhaps when they dive deep enough, there's ancient ruins, and the reason the goblins or kobolds were there is they thought it could help them survive, and they saw the fortifications of the ancient city as a good way to ward off intruders. Or perhaps it's a large castle in the middle of a forgotten land, and was it built to keep something in, or something out? Having a meaning to your dungeon, a story behind it, can add a sense of fear or intrigue to your party. So don't just make a dungeon willy-nilly. Give it a purpose, give it something dramatic at the end. Perhaps this whole dungeon belonged to the daughter of a king, and this daughter turns out to be a lich, and she rises from the grave at the end, and battle ensues. Making a dungeon dramatic can also make it something worth to remember. Number 5, and lastly, say your players walk into your dungeon. You're excited to give them an experience of a lifetime, but through classic player shenanigans, they manage to skip the entire dungeon. This, obviously, is a problem many dungeon masters run into, but fret not, because there's no harm in reusing things your players have never seen. Say they do pass by 98% of the dungeon and just get to the boss room or the treasure room almost immediately. Why not just recycle all the mechanics, the traps, and all the other interesting things for a dungeon that's their next adventure, or just perhaps down the road? We as dungeon masters spend a lot of time preparing for our players, their experience, their adventure, and when they skip by it, it can feel kind of lame. But weirdly enough, by reusing assets, you can still ensure that quality experience with less effort on your part, and as a dungeon master, I'm always looking for shortcuts. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this is useful. I hope this unlocks the secrets of Aetherius for you. I made this video mainly because currently, as we speak, I am making my own dungeon and trying to lay out different traps and interesting things for my players to experience. And I thought I would just depart with some of the knowledge that I've gathered, and hopefully this helps you. So I bid you adieu, have a good evening, night, morning, or if you don't have a concept of time, I hope you have a good eternity. Adios.